Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In a typical year, groundwater provides about a third of the state's water use on average, but in drier years, even more. Despite this reliance on groundwater, its use in California has been largely unregulated until recently. The result, many basins, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, are overdrafted, and that results in sinking lands, dry wells, degraded water quality, among other things. Is there a better way to address California's water woes? Our guest, Ellen Hanak, who's the director of the Water Policy Center at the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California, thinks so. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So 2014, pretty seminal year in water. That's when the state enacted the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, otherwise known as SGMA. How did it change water management in California?
This was a revolutionary change. We had adopted in California our modern water code for surface water 100 years before that. And groundwater just was kind of that third rail that you couldn't touch for all of the time, all those 100 years in between. But we were facing such a severe drought in the mid 2010s that we started to see some of those effects you mentioned, sinking lands, dry wells, just really, really accelerate. And it led to enough of a recognition of that there was a legislative majority that passed the bill, and the governor signed it.
So you've suggested there's 2 possible ways to deal with this, market-based tools to deal with this, called water trading and water banking. So for people who don't understand, can you give us the basics of water trading and water banking?
Sure. So the idea of water trading is that people who have water users who have rights, some of them are very long-standing rights going back, decades. They can transfer that water to somebody else in exchange, usually for payment, and that allows more flexibility, more economic flexibility to kind of get water to the crops that really will suffer if they don't have it, and where you'll lose a lot more money and jobs if those crops don't have it, but also to urban growth. As the economy grows, and also to the environment sometimes.
Yeah,
that's water trading.
Okay.
And water banking is really a supply augmentation strategy. It's a way of recharging the groundwater and keeping track of what you're recharging so that the individual users can draw on that in later years. And it's a way to both incentivize people to put that money underground, and also it's a way for them to manage their risk.
So what are some of the advantages of this water trading and water banking?
Well, we've done some estimates that suggest that meeting groundwater sustainability under this law that you mentioned, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, you could reduce the costs of getting to sustainability by almost 3/4 if you combine trading, flexible water use trading, and robust groundwater banking programs. So that's huge. And trading allows you to really do a lot of benefits for the economy and for local jobs, even with the same amount of water, by moving water from some uses that just don't generate as much income for the economy into activities that do.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised when I was reading your report about that, basically almost 2/3 savings. I mean, were you surprised by those numbers? It seems like those are big numbers.
Those are big numbers. And it's interesting because in the San Joaquin Valley, it's a very rich agricultural area, about 4.5 million acres of irrigated cropland. some of the, biggest ag region in the biggest ag state, right? But there's a lot of diversity in the crops that are grown, and that's what leads to these incentives for trading. That you've got, some we still got a lot of irrigated pasture and alfalfa, for example, in the valley, and that's not a wasteful use of water, but when times are tight, some of the folks who are growing alfalfa are going to be incentivized to transfer that water to folks who are growing some, nuts, fruits, vegetables that generate a lot more income and jobs per unit of water used.
Well, it's interesting that some of these groundwater sustainability agencies that are responsible for implementing SGMA, they haven't really been paying attention, at least initially, to these market-based solutions, have they?
It's starting, and the latest drought is really pushing that envelope quite a bit, I would say.
It's getting their attention. I think initially it was on their radar screen. It was recharge basins and things like that, and now increasingly they're looking at, okay, water markets is maybe a solution. Maybe there is a market-based solution to this problem. What a surprise. Well, when we come back, what are the essential components of a well-functioning water market? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about water trading and water markets as a possible market-based solution for our ongoing water crisis. Our next guest is Andrew Ayres. He's an environmental and natural resource economist and a research fellow with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks very much for having me.
So in your work, you identify 5 essential features of effective and responsible water markets. So let's walk through them, one by one. The first one you talk about are clearly defined and secure property rights. What does that mean when in the context of water markets?
Well, the first thing that it means in this case, Mark, is a set of volumetric, well-defined, and delineated amounts of water that water users are able to access, whether that be diverting from surface water sources or pumping from groundwater. What's really important here is that it provides a certain level of certainty to buyers and sellers in the market. And when it comes to California's case, surface water rights are generally well-defined in this sense. There are set rules that govern who can use how much water, whether they can trade it, and to whom. But in the case of groundwater, some of those new property rights are still being defined following SGMA.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing. The surface water rights, everybody kind of knows what's going on there, but groundwater, which is increasingly important, not so sure. But SGMA is going to have a big effect on that, obviously. And it's all about, making sure the numbers are right, which means it goes to kind of your second recommendation. That is, proper accounting is really important for water trading. I guess what you're talking about is accurate measurement, accurate reporting, accurate verification for market transactions, right?
Yeah, but even absent market transactions, it's really important to set up strong accounting systems so that these property rights we just talked about, that you're using, and when you are trading, that you're trading your water and not somebody else's. Now, this is going to be really important in the groundwater banking space moving forward. So in many groundwater basins throughout California, we don't today have these really strong monitoring, accounting, and sort of verification platforms. Moving forward, if we want to start putting surface water in groundwater aquifers for later extraction, it's going to be really important to track those deposits, keep track of them over time, and then take account of extractions when they do occur.
I think that's going to be a real challenge. Because water flows underground, and where's that water coming from? The natural aquifer. I think that's really the challenge. Whose water is it, right? There's a third thing you talk about, and that's this thing called hydraulic connections. Why are they important in establishing, helping parties transact when it comes to water?
So you need to be able to get the water from the seller to the buyer. In the case of surface water, oftentimes this can be accomplished by just different parties diverting water off of a water course at different places. But in other cases, you need built physical infrastructure to move water from one place to another. We have quite a bit of that in California, but there can be capacity constraints in terms of how much you can move at certain times that can become sort of a bottleneck. And that's talking about surface water. In the context of groundwater, sometimes this is a little bit easier because you're talking about a seller and a buyer just changing where they're pumping out of the same aquifer. And so that lends a little bit of flexibility there.
Now, you remember the groundwater is the water below your feet as opposed to surface water. It's obviously very important, particularly in these dry periods. The fourth thing you talk about is transparent market information. And I mean, obviously, that's understandable. If you've got a system that's based on easily and accessible and trustworthy information, it's going to run better. but it seems to be a little bit easier said than done, particularly when you're talking about groundwater.
Right. The key points here are allowing potential participants in the market to know who's got water to trade, and to allow them to sort of assess and set up some sort of expectation of what the price might be. The key piece here is really setting up a system based on the accounting platforms that we mentioned a moment ago that's going to instill trust in the system, so that people understand that when they participate either as sellers or buyers, they're not getting a raw deal.
Yeah, I think it reminds you of what Ronald Reagan said one time, what trust but verify, particularly important when we're talking about water and groundwater. Listen, there's one last question I want to ask you in this segment. That was, you said that you have to consider the possible negative impacts on third parties. I'm wondering, what are those possible negative impacts, and what can be done to mitigate them?
Great question. So there are a number of potential impacts. On the one hand, for example, in a groundwater system, impacts of pumping, lowering nearby water tables, potentially causing subsidence, which is a lowering of the land surface, some other impacts. What's important here in the context of a trading system is that we need to maintain a system that allows for easy, low-cost transactions to lend flexibility to water management, while also being able to document these kinds of impacts and put the parties in contact with one another to help address them. What's going to work best is a set of simple rules that are sort of broadly predictable by market participants.
Yeah, you better set up the rules, because what's the saying? Water's for drinking, and whiskey is for drinking, and water is for fighting, right?
Exactly.
So you better have good rules in place. So when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the possible bottlenecks to making all this work. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. There is considerable optimism about the potential for water markets to help California transition to a more sustainable groundwater management system and better build resilience to climate change. There are some concerns, however. Ellen Hanak, the director of the Water Policy Center at the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California, is back with us again. You've spoken to a lot of folks about these issues, about water markets, et cetera, and sustainable groundwater management. What are some of the concerns you're hearing from folks about the gaps when it comes to groundwater governance?
So, we talked about the arrival of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014. It is truly a revolutionary piece of legislation. It's requiring local water users to form new agencies to manage their basin, develop plans, understand the accounts for the basin, how much they're using, how much their deficit is, and develop projects and actions to address that. And that's a lot. And so folks have been hard at work since the legislation was enacted in late 2014. But in some ways, we're still really in the early days of this. And so establishing the detailed accounts, Andrew talked about the importance of allocations so that everybody knows how much they can pump. That's a precursor to any kind of trading or banking where you're crediting people. And we're not there yet in most basins.
Yeah, another thing that you talk about are the bottlenecks dealing with water training infrastructure. What are they?
So this is one of those preconditions for trading, especially when you're moving surface water around, is having the ability to get it from one user to the other. California has pretty good surface water infrastructure, but there are some creaky parts of it. And in the San Joaquin Valley, some of the major regional conveyance network pieces have been damaged and lost capacity because of excess groundwater use and because of subsidence or land sinking. So that needs to be addressed. There are also major bottlenecks in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, where we move water from Sacramento Valley down to points south of that area, including the San Joaquin Valley. And then, there's a question of whether or not we need some new stuff in addition to kind of improving capacity of existing things, both to transfer water and also to capture water and bank it in those high flow, in those high storms.
Yeah, the infrastructure is becoming increasingly important. You're also talking about setting up the system for water trading. It's likely to involve various governmental agencies. Can you explain the different tensions that might occur between federal, state, and local agencies when it comes to setting up something like this?
Right. So in that context, it's important for folks to know that water has a lot of different flavors and colors. in California, there's federal water rights and federal projects like the Central Valley Project. There's the State Water Project. There are a lot of local projects. Groundwater falls under different regimes, and you have these tensions where, in order to, Andrew mentioned, you need to be thinking about these third party impacts, and making sure that people are transferring their water, not somebody else's, making sure they're not causing bad things to happen to other water users or the environment. And there's a lot of approvals that have to happen there, but you've also got, different processes that the feds have to follow from the state. Locals, counties, and local irrigation districts often have their own rules, and sometimes those are kind of parochial, and everybody's worried about managing their own risk and not about the bigger picture.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was thinking. That the local districts, in particular, they want to hold on to their own water. They don't want to trade it necessarily. They want to keep it within their own jurisdiction. I assume that would be a problem.
That can be, and there have been board elections for local water boards where folks have lost their jobs because they were approving the idea of water trading, even though that could be good for the growers. It could be good for the local economy to move some of that water, but it's sometimes when people are scared of things they don't know.
Yeah. So what's the answer there? Is to educate them about the benefits of water trading. In other words, moving water to the most efficient and effective needs for that water.
I think that's what we recommend, and with an eye to addressing making sure that you're reviewing and addressing impacts that there could be, and finding ways to help out with those.
Yeah, all important. Well, up next, we're going to talk about the design of responsible water markets. What does that mean? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about creating a market for water as a way to efficiently and effectively address California's perennial water challenges. We're rejoined by Andrew Ayres. He's an environmental and natural resource economist and research fellow with the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California. So I want to ask you about the different ways that California can work to design and establish kind of an effective and responsible water market. What are they, and who's responsible for making these changes?
So in our recent report on this topic, we lay out quite a few recommendations. I'll summarize a few of the important ones here. The first is making progress on setting up groundwater allocations in the basins that don't already have them. This is primarily going to be a task for groundwater sustainability agencies and their members. The second is continuing to make progress on flexibility in trading surface water. So this is prior appropriation rights, state water project entitlements, CVP entitlements, and that's primarily a task for the state and federal agencies that manage some of those projects and water rights. So the State Water Board, Department of Water Resources, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation.
Yeah, there are. We talked earlier about, there was going to be a pushback here. There's going to be some arguments against SGMA and against water trading, that there's these unintended consequences that third parties are going to be impacted. So it's hard to anticipate, I guess, the whole term unanticipated, unintended consequences. But can you try to anticipate what those are, and can you effectively navigate some of those trade-offs for water market design?
Yeah, I think just to help frame things here, I'd like to distinguish between sort of some of the negative impacts of diversions and pumping, especially when it comes to negative impacts of pumping. SGMA is really going to help with this. It's going to set up a system of rules whereby people can know, are they pumping within the rules or not? Then when we layer trading on top of that, it's really important to have a system that assesses both the physical impacts of trading. If I move pumping, for example, in a groundwater aquifer from one location to another, who's going to be impacted, as well as a system that tries to address some of the economic impacts of moving water use around, in the sense that can lead to fallowing or other impacts in the selling regions.
Yeah,
restrictions on trading can be one aspect, perhaps, of helping to address that.
Yeah, equity, fairness is going to be a big issue here. It's very important that people have a perception that this thing is being done fairly. So how can the federal, state, and local agencies help level the playing field when it comes to water markets?
I think it's really important that folks have good information about, like I mentioned earlier in the program here, who's got water to sell, what are the prevailing prices, to the extent that we can get a handle on that. And again, what are going to be the potential impacts of moving water around? So this might include providing improved public information on water supply conditions and rights holders. So documenting who are the rights holders in the state and what trades are happening.
Yeah. So, the other thing we talked about earlier was some of the problems dealing with infrastructure in California. I mean, we seem to have a pretty good system, though some of it is collapsing because of all this groundwater banking. We've had subsidence and they're trying to shore up some of the canals. But what do you think else needs to be done to kind of improve the water infrastructure system to help make water markets really effective and efficient?
So getting back to our point about hydrologic connections, I think there are some smart plays in terms of new investment in infrastructure for conveying surface water. But really, I think one of the big areas for advancement here is just starting to look harder at our groundwater aquifers as infrastructure for storing water, banking water, as you mentioned, from wet years for later extraction in dry years. And a more concerted approach to doing that, including setting up accounting systems, will help with some of the impacts on surface infrastructure from overpumping that you just alluded to.
Yeah, and we heard that some of the issues with subsidence where the land is collapsing, you then lose that aquifer, right? Because once you lose it, you lose it. And so
aquifer, and it can have impacts on surface water conveyance by buckling canals. So
right.
So a twofer.
Right. And that all, it gets worse and worse. It just creates more problems. So, finally, I want to talk to you about what can and should be done to promote local and regional collaboration. There's a lot of, it's mine, I don't want to share, even though for the greater good of the state, it might be smart to share. How do you get over that, those local and regional challenges? How do you create more collaboration for water trading and water banking?
So I think some of those concerns around not wanting to share are driven by potential impacts of moving large amounts of water out of irrigation districts or out of certain communities that can have a negative impact on the finances of the irrigation district. It can potentially have a negative impact on public revenues in the selling region. And so one thing that can be done to help with this is to come up with both local and regional efforts to address land transitions. So what's going to happen with lands that come out of irrigated production in order to make sure that they have productive uses and that they don't turn into local nuisances. So this is something where state agencies can help. And the Department of Conservation has a multi-benefit land repurposing program that's received $90 million. And that's one step in the right direction to making sure.
We'll have to take a closer look at that. I want to thank our guests from the PPIC for joining us. If you want to stay current with local and state politics, you can sign up for the Maddy Daily by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Institute. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.